In South Africa, violence is everywhere. It's in schools, it's in homes, it's in public services, it's all over the place, on the streets. And our, let's call it our national community has been getting very frustrated about this violence, especially violence against women, violence in schools, because it's so commonplace, and there are so many gruesome acts that are committed, and everyone's talking about it and saying the violence has to stop, violence has to stop. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as imposing harsher sentences or having more consequences, in like legal consequences for violence. Sorry, I'm just getting this cricket to be quiet. Let's take violence in schools as an example. There's now two different kinds. There's violence where the students are violent and hurting each other, sometimes killing each other in school, and sometimes where the students are violent against their teachers, and then in some cases where the teachers are violent against children. Now, it's become widespread enough that it's being recognized as a sort of a national problem, with certain areas having higher rates than others. It seems at the moment to be mostly the lower income schools, although obviously the posh private schools have their own different types of issues. And it's pretty scary to imagine being a teacher in South Africa these days, because teachers are literally getting assaulted, getting stabbed, getting threatened by their students when they try and, for example, get students to leave their cell phones during class and focus on class. So it's pretty extreme stuff that's going on. And I know there's other countries like Mexico where violence is also a huge issue. And the question I think that we really need to start asking is, why is there so much violence? Not how do we stop the violence, because I don't think that that root cause is being addressed enough. It's not being considered enough. We're not looking enough at our own behaviors, at our own social structures, at our own family designs. What are these kids learning, and where are they learning from to feel that violence is an acceptable behavior, to feel that it is something that's their right, to think that it's okay to treat someone like that, and that lack of consideration for someone else is, the consideration just isn't a part of their realm of awareness. So you could say that it's a very selfish point of view, because it's entirely considering only personal interest, only personal gain, because when we're in that violent state of mind, we don't consider what it's really doing to someone else. We don't consider that it's hurting someone else, whether physically or emotionally. We just want what we want, and we want to prove ourselves, or establish our dominance, or whatever it is. And it absolutely is we, us, and our, because we are all violent in some way or another in our personal lives, maybe just not to those extreme degrees. But if you take something that happens far more than most of us care to believe, violence in home, where a parent is violent towards their spouse or towards their kids. And it doesn't have to be physical violence. It can be there's different types of violence and different degrees of it. And I know it's something that I'm definitely guilty of, is violent thoughts. When I get angry, I wish harm upon other people. I hope that they get, like, bitten by a mutant spider or die in a terrible car accident, or I imagine punching their faces in. And I'm totally I'm not okay with that. But in those moments when I'm angry, my principles tend to be a little bit more difficult to hold on to. So it's quite an effort to remind myself that that's really not who I want to be, really not what I want to be participating in. But it's taken a process for me to get to this point, to know who do I want to be, what do I not want to be, what is and is not acceptable to me. And it's taken a lot of work on my part to get there. So how could we implement this level of developing self-awareness to see, okay, I'm getting angry now, do I really want to carry on this path? And the tools to change the behavior in those moments when it's here, when it's happening, when it's taking over. How do we give those tools to everyone to be able to apply that in their own lives, in themselves? And so these days we have this wonderful tool called the internet, but that doesn't necessarily instill the desire to change on anyone. And that is, I think, probably the most important element when it comes to starting off a process of actually changing, is wanting to change and being willing to put in the work, because it is an individual process that requires self-movement and self-responsibility, knowing I can't make anyone else change. So what I can be is an example. And for all of those, for everyone who is a leader or an example in some way, which is everyone, we're all leaders or examples in some aspects of our lives, but parents with their kids, are we teaching our children to be violent? Are we supporting them to develop tools, or are we only showing them the violence, the anger, the hatred? Are we teaching them to also become what we are? Or do we say, hang on, I'm sorry for what I just did. It's not who I want to be. This is why I don't want to be that. And this is what I've actually been trying to do to change. And in that moment, I slipped, and I apologize, because that's not the example that I want to be for you. And at this point, at the very least, that is what we can do in our personal lives, is be those examples. The different spheres of leadership can implement those leadership examples in different ways. And community members, where in South Africa, violence is a very common part of community activities. Like protests are very often violent, and social events very often end up with fights breaking up, whether it's at soccer games or at a pub or wherever. Violence is something that's or that anger, that hatred, and it's not necessarily towards each other. It's all stuff, it's all our own stuff that we're just taking out on each other. But it's just beneath the surface for so many of us that it doesn't take much to let it come out. So yes, be an example of how to live something different, but also be an example of being willing to face the truth of what we're feeling and why we're feeling that way and what we've been holding on to. Why am I angry? Why am I hateful? Why am I violent? Who and what have I lived to develop these experiences within me? And whenever a thought comes of wanting to assign the responsibility to someone else, or they made me feel this way, better stop, better check yourself, because no one can make anyone feel anything. It's all inner stuff. Like that one Facebook post that's been floating around again of a monk who was on a boat meditating and his eyes were closed and he felt something bump into his boat and he assumed that it was another person come to interrupt his meditation. And before he opened his eyes, he got very angry and he was imagining all these things he was going to say to this other person. But he opened his eyes and it was just an empty boat. And he realized in that moment that the anger was not caused by anyone else. It was already within him, and it only takes external triggers to bring it out. So that element of self-responsibility is so missing in our in our society at the moment on so many different levels. We need to keep reminding each other that self-responsibility is the key, that we are each our own creators. No one else is responsible or to blame for how we're experiencing ourselves or the choices we make. Okay, thank you very much for watching. You're going to see me next time.